Hey everyone, I like to do videos about Bitcoin when I get questions from people because it gives me a good indication of what would be valuable to talk about. So I have talked to multiple people this week who are all in the same position, which is they have Bitcoin that was bought somewhere between $40,000 and $90,000. And they're up on that Bitcoin, up at $105,000. Right as I start recording this, it's $105,500. So halfway between 105 and 106,000 per coin. And so they're up, some as much as more than double, almost triple, others that are just up, 10 or 15%, or I guess that'd be whatever, 15, 20% or 25%, things like that. And they have a need for some of that capital that is stored in the form of Bitcoin in the next month or two, or in the next 6 or 12 months. In some cases, it's people that need to buy a car or a house. And so as soon as that opportunity presents itself, they will need access to that capital. In other situations, it's people that want to make investments or have other capital needs that are longer term, more in the 6 or 9 or 12 months case. But in all cases, they will need some of that capital over time. So the question is, what do you do in a situation like that? Because you've got to make a choice. Do you sell the Bitcoin at 105,000 per coin and lock in the gain you have, and then guarantee that you'll have exactly the capital you need for whatever it is you need to buy in the next month or two, or even in the next 6 or 12 months? Or do you leave it in Bitcoin and try to capture as much of the upside as possible? Well, so I can't answer that question for you because, one, I'm not a financial analyst, so everything I offer is just my personal opinion. But I can give you some helpful frameworks to think about it. Okay, so the first way to think about it is probabilities. What is the probability that you will be up on that Bitcoin versus down? And I'm going to record a separate video that talks about the likelihood of a major price correction in Bitcoin prior to, a parabolic rise. I'll do a video immediately after this one that talks about that. So let's, for this case, I'll just use probabilities of, let's call it 70-30. So I would say there's a 70% chance that leaving the Bitcoin in the form of Bitcoin will end up better for you in the near term than otherwise, than liquidating it now. 70-30 in your favor, meaning I would say you have better than 2-to-1 odds leaving it in Bitcoin. The problem is that leaves a 30% chance that you're going to end up on the wrong side of that, and that Bitcoin will go through a price correction at the worst possible time for you, meaning you have to liquidate it at a price that potentially is lower than you paid for it if you have Bitcoin you bought in the high price range. Now, if you got Bitcoin, you bought it in the 40,000s or 50,000s, I don't think we'll ever see those prices again. So I don't even think it's possible that Bitcoin drops below, let's call it below 50,000. I think that it's extremely improbable it drops into the 60s, but it's not completely impossible. It drops into the 70s. We've seen prices as low as just under $75,000 as recently as earlier this year. And if it can do it once, it certainly is capable of doing it again. Now, like before, I think we'll stay down there for a very short period of time. I think if we do dip below $80,000 or below $75,000, it's going to be for a very short time period, and then it will, come tearing back up, just like it did this last time. We stayed below 75, I don't know, for a day or hours, some number of hours or days. It was not weeks. And even in the 80,000s, we were not down there very long, a series of weeks or whatever it was, but it just wasn't that long. So if you're patient a little bit, it bounces right back. But in the next video, I'll talk about the probability that we go through an extended bear market and what that feels like and how to think about it. But I think there's, 70-30, the odds are in your favor. And so then it comes to down to what is your risk appetite? How effectively can you handle a downturn? If Bitcoin's in a downturn, do you have other capital that you can deploy instead? So let me run some scenarios for you. Let's say you have Bitcoin in retirement accounts and you're in your 40s, like I am. I'm 45. Then I would say, of course, leave it in Bitcoin. There's absolutely no benefit to pulling it out of Bitcoin. You do not want to time the market. You do not want to try to, sell high and buy low. You're going to always screw that up. Everyone always does. Don't try that. So if your Bitcoin is in retirement accounts. You don't even have to think about it. You just leave it there. Okay, but what if you're right up at retirement? You're retiring in the next year or two. I would say, okay, how badly do you need that money that's in the form of Bitcoin? Is it 100% probable that you're retiring? And is there no conceivable way you can get capital from some other source in a dip? And if the answer is you absolutely have to have that capital and there's no other source you can possibly get it from, then I would say, well, that's a tough situation to be in, and you might need to liquidate some of that to create a cushion, to create a buffer, to make sure that you're not stuck selling Bitcoin when it's down. And at a minimum, you can get $105,000 for it right now. But again, it's painful to do that because, we could, run up to $150,000 or $180,000 per Bitcoin by the end of the year. That's certainly possible. We don't know. So it's obviously painful to liquidate it at 105 when it can run up there. And even if it pulls back after that, it could be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars in the next 2 or 3 years. So it's just, painful to liquidate it at 105 with that much upside in the future. But again, if it all comes down to your risk appetite and the flexibility of your capital, how many different ways can you access capital and how desperate are you to not sell when you're down? So that's an individualized decision. And so I know people, for example, that have set aside money in the form of Bitcoin to buy a car, but they're also not, they don't have to have a car now. They just want a car in the not too distant future. And, their cost basis is in the $70,000 range. So they're way up on that. They can afford a much nicer car, or they can buy the same car they would have bought otherwise and pocket the difference because they're up, 40% or something like that on their money. But some of those situations, the person is very flexible. If Bitcoin goes through a prolonged downturn, they can wait an extra year or two to buy a car. So I know people in that situation. I know people in the situation where they don't have any flexibility. They're going to absolutely need that money in the near term, but they do have other sources of capital that they could draw on. And so they don't have to liquidate Bitcoin if it's down temporarily. And then again, I know other people who are like, you know what? I don't technically know anybody. I don't think I know anybody that absolutely positively has zero flexibility, no access to any other capital whatsoever, absolutely could not ride out even the slightest downturn. I just don't know anybody in that situation. Everybody I know who I've talked to, which is a fair number of people over the last couple of weeks, everybody's got some flexibility. They've either got some flexibility where they can delay the purchase of a car, or they can finance a larger percent of a house, or they can draw on other resources, or, in an emergency situation, there's people who are open to taking out a home equity line of credit, or, some other sort of, borrowing against a 401k plan, things like that. Although I universally advise people to not borrow money. Certainly do not borrow money to buy Bitcoin. If you borrow money to avoid having to sell Bitcoin, that's different. It's certainly better if you're going to borrow money, it's certainly better to borrow it to avoid selling Bitcoin rather than to borrow it to buy Bitcoin. I would not recommend anyone borrow money to buy Bitcoin or any other investment. But even in my situation, I have borrowed money to avoid selling Bitcoin. I financed my 2026 Tesla Model Y that I just bought a couple months ago. I could have easily liquidated Bitcoin and bought that Tesla, but instead I financed it for 5 years at a 6% interest through Trustmark. And I did that to avoid selling whatever it was, whatever percentage of a Bitcoin it would have cost to buy that thing brand new, which is what I otherwise would have done. I would have just bought it straight up with Bitcoin. But I didn't want to liquidate that Bitcoin, so now I have a car payment. First time in my life I've ever had a car payment. Not because I need a car payment, I could easily pay it off at any time, but because I just didn't want to part with that Bitcoin. I would rather have sat on that Bitcoin than part with it. And at the time I purchased the car, Bitcoin was at $85,000 per coin. So now Bitcoin's up at $105,000 per coin, which means the payments I'm making on that car are pretty significantly discounted because I'm paying with $105,000 Bitcoin, but I financed it with, at the time Bitcoin was $85,000, which is what I would have had to liquidate if I had liquidated the Bitcoin to buy the car back in March at $85,000. So even I have taken out a loan, in my case, to buy a Tesla, that I otherwise would not have, to avoid selling Bitcoin. So again, I do think about that differently. I would not take out a loan to buy Bitcoin, but I have taken out and do have a loan taken out to avoid selling Bitcoin. So anyway, everybody's situation is different, and it also depends on your risk appetite. Some people are very conservative, and they just really don't want to lose money no matter what. And one of the downsides of trying to make sure you absolutely don't lose money no matter what is you have to invest much more conservatively, which is unfortunate because it means your potential returns are much lower. I am a person who has a very high risk appetite, and I don't mind, riding through a downturn. And in the next video that I record immediately after this, I'll tell everybody, what that's like and what the future might hold and what it's going to feel like and all that sort of stuff. And you can make your own decision. But again, it all comes down to how much capital do you need? When do you need it? How painful will it be if the price of Bitcoin is down at the time you do need it? Do you have any other sources of capital you can use so that you can avoid using that capital? And anyway, that's sort of the highlights, and I will, in a minute here, record a video about how to, the different ways things could play out over the next 6 to 12 months for Bitcoin. So have a great night, everyone. Thanks.